Hi, I'm Michael Jantzi, a member of the ISSB.
And I'm Sue Lloyd, Vice Chair of the ISSB.
In this webcast, we will provide an overview of the ISSB's first agenda consultation that recently concluded with the publication of a feedback statement at the end of June. The consultation enabled us to understand the market's view on what the ISSB should focus on over the next 2 years. Using this feedback, we formulated our work plan for now until mid-2026.
We're also going to provide an update on recent developments between the ISSB and strategic partners, including the Transition Plan Task Force, the GHG Protocol, CDP, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and the Global Reporting Initiative. These strategic relationships are key as we embark on this new 2-year work plan.
So specifically, we're going to take you through 3 key areas. First, an overview of the process for developing the work plan. Second, the ISSB's key decisions as set out on this slide. And lastly, recent developments in our strategic relationships. In 2023, the ISSB conducted a public agenda consultation on its activities and its work plan. This was based on nearly a year of research and engagement with market participants to develop a prototype of the work plan that then could be consulted on. Based on this research, we published a request for information in May 2023 to gather stakeholder views on 3 key areas. First, the strategic direction and balance of our activities. Next, the suitability of criteria for assessing sustainability-related reporting matters to prioritize and add to our work plan. And finally, new research projects that could be added to the work plan. The request for information was published in May 2023 with a 120-day comment period, which ended in September of 2023. In total, we received 433 responses from a broad range of stakeholders across all geographical regions, including 70 responses from investors and investor groups. The views of investors are really important to the ISSB because ultimately they are the users of the sustainability-related disclosures, so focusing on areas that will best meet their information needs is vital. My fellow board members and our staff also participated in 71 outreach events with stakeholders from approximately 44 jurisdictions in relation to the agenda consultation. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our stakeholders who provided feedback to the request for information. From November 2023 to April 2024, we considered the feedback and set priorities for the 2024 to 2026 work plan. Decisions were made in 3 key areas. In February, we finalized the criteria we would use for prioritizing new research and standard-setting projects. In March, we made the decision on strategic direction and the balance of the ISSB's activities. This was followed up in April with decisions on which projects to add to the work plan. So, as an experienced standard setter, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how our first agenda consultation process went. We also put in a lot of time and effort into engaging with our stakeholders and making sure their perspectives are understood. So could you also share some views on why the public consultation process is so important for the ISSB?
Sure. So as standard setters, we want to ensure we're responding to what the market really demands and what their needs are, especially in this really relatively new area of sustainability-related reporting. So it's firstly helpful for us to consult. Also, public consultation is a mandatory part of our due process, so we also have to do this from a sort of formal perspective. So I'd note that for our first agenda consultation, one thing that was a little bit different was that we consulted on a 2-year work plan rather than the standard 5-year plan that's set out in our due process handbook requirements. And this was partly due to the evolving landscape of sustainability-related reporting and our need to be flexible enough and to keep capacity to respond to sustainability-related risks and opportunities and information and reporting needs as they arise. So that was by design. And I think for me, the scale and the variety of feedback that we've received shows just how complex and important the issues are. And like Michael, I'd really like to thank all of our stakeholders who provided us with feedback that's helped us to shape our work plan. And on a personal note, I was really impressed by the overall number of responses, especially from investors giving us written responses. On both accounts, this volume is much higher than anything I've seen before as a standard setter in terms of responses to an agenda consultation.
Thank you, Sue. That perspective is really interesting, and I think speaks to the robustness of that process. So in terms of the strategic direction and balance of activities, feedback to the agenda consultation indicated that most of our stakeholders viewed that supporting the implementation of IFRS S1 and IFRS S2 as the highest priority for the next 2 years. As the feedback reiterated, we recognize the importance of consistent and high quality implementation of S1 and S2 around the world, which supports our mission to deliver a comprehensive global baseline of sustainability-related financial disclosures. As a result of this, we decided 2 things: to place a high level of focus on supporting the implementation of both S1 and S2, and a slightly lower level of focus on enhancing the SASB standards and beginning new research projects. And we decided to give both of these areas equal attention. We decided against specifying how much focus to place on the core activities of connectivity with the IASB, interoperability and other sustainability-related standards and frameworks, and stakeholder engagement. We also decided to reserve some capacity to accommodate the emerging themes that are undoubtedly going to emerge. I would note that all the ISSB's activities are interrelated, so there, of course, is a potential for important synergies. For example, enhancing the SASB standards will no doubt support the high-quality implementation of S1 and provide a basis of understanding, centered, of course, on industry-specific risks and opportunities to inform the thematic research projects. Sue, given the finite capacity of the IFRS Foundation and also of our stakeholders and the wide-ranging demands of our work, could you provide our listeners with a little bit more in regards to details on the factors that were considered when determining how to balance the activities in the work plan?
Sure, and this is also always one of the really trickiest things as a standard setter. There's so much you could do, but it's only so much you can do. So this balance is really critical. And so there were 7 criteria that we put in the request for information and asked for feedback on that we'd sort of proposed to determine the priority of our new research and standard setting projects. And I'm not going to go through all of those now, it's a long list, but I'll point out that we did borrow these criteria from our sister board at the IASB. So they're sort of tested in the past. And based on the feedback we got, we decided to use 6 of these criteria with no substantive changes, but we did amend 1 criterion on how we would consider how potential projects relate to other projects to make it explicit that the ISSB wouldn't just consider how the project relates to other work in our work plan, but also consider how it relates to the work of other relevant standard setters. And this was done to ensure that the board considers opportunities to pursue or enhance so-called interoperability when we assess, what we should prioritise in our work.
So turning to our core activities, as we noted earlier, we decided not to specify how much focus to place on them because all of our core activities are really integral to all of our work. On connectivity with the IASB, we've set up processes to share knowledge, materials, and resources to enable connected reporting. We've set up processes to ensure that the IASB's and the ISSB's requirements are compatible, complementary, and consistent. And finally, we're working to ensure that our projects or activities with sustainability-related considerations are cohesive.
So on interoperability, we'll continue to focus on this area by engaging with stakeholders, sustainability standard setters and framework providers such as EFRAG, the European Sustainability Standard Setter, and GRI. And we'll do that in various ways, both engaging bilaterally with those parties, but also in some of our working groups, so our jurisdictional working group, the JWG, and the Sustainability Standards Advisory Forum. And one really important example of our interoperability work, a little ad break here, is the interoperability guidance that we recently published together with EFRAG in May. And that joint interoperability guidance describes how closely we've managed to align our disclosure requirements, particularly for the areas of climate reporting that we have in common, and also sets out information that an entity that starts either with our standards or with ESRS, the European standards, can use to know how to comply with both sets of standards in an efficient way. So I really recommend that as a useful piece of guidance for our stakeholders.
On the stakeholder engagement front, we proactively engage with a whole range of stakeholders to ensure widespread stakeholder feedback on our consultations. We continue to broaden and deepen our engagement with stakeholder groups that tend to be underrepresented in the standard setting process sometimes, such as stakeholders from emerging markets and developing economies, or sometimes referred to as EMDEs. The ISSB is committed to ensuring that the ISSB standards are proportionate for these EMDEs. And although not identified as a core activity, proportionality is really an important aspect of our work. In current and future work, the ISSB will carefully consider the feasibility of requirements for companies with a range of skills, capabilities, and resources around the world, and will propose mechanisms to ensure that we are developing a truly global baseline of disclosures. Now, moving on to consider the specific activities that have been added to the work plan, I'd like to focus on a couple of areas. Again, as we've said, most respondents considered supporting IFRS S1 and IFRS S2 as being essential to the successful creation of that global baseline. So that is really the first focus of our attention. Many respondents also indicated that the effective implementation of S1 and S2 was essential to strengthen the credibility of the ISSB standards overall. And a few indicated that supporting the implementation of S1 and S2 should be the ISSB's sole focus for the next couple of years, and stated that a post-implementation review of S1 and S2 should inform the ISSB's future research and standard setting projects. So in line with this feedback, we agreed that supporting consistent and high quality implementation of IFRS S1 and IFRS S2 by companies and jurisdictions around the world should be our highest priority. And so we decided to assign a high level of focus to this activity. So to achieve this, we're doing a number of different things. We're developing educational materials that explain key areas of the standards. We're convening the transition implementation group to discuss companies' questions related to implementation. We're also monitoring the progress of relevant standard setters and framework providers to assess potential implications for S1 and S2. We're supporting the IFRS Foundation's comprehensive capacity building program. And finally, we're supporting companies in using the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Taxonomy, which is certainly close to my heart. And we're hoping that taxonomy is going to be leveraged because it enhances the efficient digital consumption and comparison of reports. Sue, do you have any additional thoughts to share on how our work is supporting the implementation of S1 and S2?
Well, firstly, I'd say it was really clear in the feedback that we received on the request for information that this was an area that our stakeholders across the board really wanted us to prioritise. And for me, basically, people told us as a bit of a plea, we've got a lot to do already using your new standards, and don't forget about it. And remember that you've got a role to play to ensure that these standards get off to a good start. So we heard that loud and clear. I think the other thing I'd say is that implicit in all the decisions that we've made on our new work plan, even when we're talking about the new topics, which we're going to talk about in a moment, we're working on the basis that IFRS S1, our sort of comprehensive standard setting up the core of the global baseline, will continue to serve as the foundation that we'll be building on. So it sets out the core content for a complete set of financial disclosures on sustainability-related risks and opportunities that are reasonably expected to affect an entity's prospects, as defined in the standard. And what we're doing here is looking at where more specific disclosures would really enhance that global baseline. And the activities that you nicely set out there, Michael, list the sort of combination of tools, training materials, forums that we're using to really make sure that preparers and others have got what they need to really understand our standards and to put them into practice.
Thank you, Sue. Now let's take a look at our work to enhance the SASB standards. The SASB standards, of course, are designed to be proportionate for companies and help enable them to make industry-specific disclosures that provide decision-useful information for investors across a range of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So the board's rationale for enhancing the SASB standards includes a couple of key things, and I'd like to take a moment to focus on those now. First of all, enhancing the SASB standards supports our implementation of IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. A company that applies IFRS S1, obviously, is required to consider the SASB standards in identifying sustainability risks and opportunities and associated disclosures. And as a result, the SASB standards obviously then play a key role in supporting disclosures of relevant information for investors on topics beyond climate. And for climate, obviously, they'd use S2. As a result, the quality of industry-based disclosures rely on the quality of the SASB standards. And so by enhancing the SASB standards, we can ensure that the global baseline is really providing the information that investors need globally across a range of sustainability-related risks and opportunities that can affect their different industries. Secondly, we believe that enhancing the SASB standards also reinforces the work in our research projects. So, for example, many of the SASB standards include nature-related disclosure topics and associated metrics, covering, again, for example, water and wastewater management, ecological impacts, material sourcing, product design, and life cycle management, just to name a few. This is also the case for human capital, with the SASB standards covering things such as employee health and safety, employee engagement, diversity, and labor practices, among others. Disclosures in accordance with the SASB standards and metrics could also be relevant to inform the ISSB's research projects, and in turn, the research on those sustainability-related risks and opportunities related to nature-related issues and human capital could inform enhancements to the SASB standards. So it's a nice virtuous circle. And finally, more broadly, I guess investors need that industry-based information. And so it's really important that the mechanism for providing these disclosures, the SASB standards, are relevant and fit for that global audience. So that focus on improvement and focus on enhancing the SASB standards is really key to the work plan over the next 2 years. Now, Sue, peers often ask me, given that we're working on the enhancements to the SASB standards, should they just wait and engage with them when those improvements or the standards are revised, or should they start working on these things now?
They shouldn't delay using the SASB standards is the short answer, because they are already a really useful resource to report on topics beyond climate. I think companies will see when they pick up the standards that they just really help understand what sorts of risks and opportunities it could be useful to report on. And over and above that, it's a requirement when you use S1 to look at those SASB standards as a source of inspiration for what risks and opportunities to report on and the appropriate associated disclosures. And we know investors want and in fact need industry-based disclosures, and it's the best set of, across the spectrum industry standards that exist in the world. And so they are the best first port of call. We are, of course, working on those. But the other thing I would say is don't stand back and watch from the sidelines. We're going to consult on the changes that we'll be making to the SASB standards. This is, these are your standards to use around the world. So there's going to be an opportunity to contribute to our enhancements. And when we make decisions about any changes, including when they apply, so how quickly these changes would come into effect, we're going to consider the feedback we receive really carefully. But overall, the SASB standards are already there. We've already done work to make sure they're internationally applicable. Now we're looking at making them even better so that over time we really ensure that they will meet investors' information needs and that they're helpful for companies as well in reporting on sustainability.
Excellent. All right. So we're going to keep moving on with the evaluation and overview of the work plan. And I want to shift now to looking at the new projects that we're going to be focused on over the next 2 years. So at our April 2024 meeting, the ISSB decided to add a research project on information about risks and opportunities associated with biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services, which we sometimes now just refer to as nature-related risks and opportunities, and a similar research project on human capital. So, Sue, before we get into these two areas, could you just briefly explain what a research project is?
Sure, and maybe what it isn't. So firstly, it's not a 10-year project. I think some people think that means it's going to be forever before they see anything, and that's not the case. But what a research project basically is it's a formal point in our work where we gather evidence about what the problem is that needs to be solved and assess whether there is a solution that can be found and that is feasible. So it's a really important first step before we start to actually propose and develop new disclosure requirements. And by doing this initial research phase and exploring whether and how standard setting might be necessary before deciding to actually dig into standard setting work, it really makes sure we've got a clear focus for our work. So it's an important first step.
Thank you, Sue. Let's dig into these research projects in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to start by focusing on the project on biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services. So biodiversity refers to the variety and the variability of life on Earth, and it's a foundational characteristic of natural systems. It's a proxy for functional, productive, and resilient ecosystems that are able to provide the ecosystem services upon which life on Earth relies. So some examples of ecosystem services are, just to name a few, climate regulation, provision of raw materials and water, pollination, and pest and flood control. And so some of the potential subtopics as part of this project might include things like water, pollution, and resource exploitation, among other things. So the ISSB decided to include a research project on biodiversity, ecosystem, and ecosystem services for a number of key reasons. And I just want to take a little bit of time to outline those. First, many economic activities depend or otherwise affect nature. So therefore, efforts to preserve, conserve, and restore nature can certainly help manage risks or give rise to opportunities for companies and preparers. These risks and opportunities can reasonably be expected to affect a company's prospects, as we describe in IFRS S1, and certainly might result in material information for investors. Secondly, we know there's a growing interest among investors for improved disclosure in this area. Investors increasingly are integrating nature-related considerations into their investment processes and decisions. And they've told us that they need more consistent, comparable, and verifiable information about companies' exposure and responses to nature-related risks and opportunities. We know that disclosure is currently lacking, primarily in relation to the quality and the availability of information in this area. So again, for example, the information companies provide is sometimes inconsistent, sometimes it's difficult to compare or measure, and the disclosure practices are a little bit underdeveloped. And finally, and this is the good news, there are existing disclosure frameworks out there, and that means that we have an opportunity at the ISSB to build from other initiatives such as the SASB standards, the CDSB guidance, and the recommendations from the Task Force on Nature Financial-Related Disclosure. Sue, could you speak a little bit more to the research project on human capital?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, the first thing to say is that human capital doesn't just refer to the people who make a company's own workforce, but also workers in the company's value chain. That's a really important part of the project that we're going to focus on. And consistent with our integrated reporting framework at the Foundation, the concept also refers to the workforce's competencies, capabilities and experience, and motivations to innovate. And it covers areas such as worker well-being, workforce investment, the alternative workforce, and labour conditions in the value chain. So a whole range of potential things. And so why did we decide to work on this? Really because human capital related risks and opportunities affect all companies, no matter who they are. And how a company manages and invests in its human capital can really directly affect its ability to deliver value over the short, medium or long term. And so there's strong support from investors for this proposed project on human capital related risks and opportunities. Investors of all types and across many jurisdictions are increasingly focused on understanding human capital and seeing it as a major driver of value. Also, labour markets are rapidly changing, and so making consistent and comparable data available that's to carry out risk and return assessments is really important. So developments in telecommunications, automation, artificial intelligence, demographics, education, and what employee expectations are have all led to huge structural changes. We've seen it all around us, I think. And also there's an increasing regulatory and public scrutiny on workforce management, which presents risks to investors, including risks that can arise in the value chain of a portfolio company. So in addition, this research project gives us an opportunity to address the lack of consistent and comparable disclosures that are available to investors today. Companies do often disclose human capital related information, but they often use qualitative boilerplate statements or disclose quantitative information using metrics that aren't standardized or using bespoke measurement methodologies. And that really affects the decision usefulness of the information for investors. And also disclosures tend to focus on a company's direct operations, and they don't address the risks or opportunities that arise in their value chain or as a result of their business model. And we know that's an area that's increasingly relevant to really understanding how these things could affect the prospects for companies. So exciting is a big word in standard setting, but I hope that, like me, Michael, you're excited that we're about to start the research on these two new topics.
I absolutely am excited. It's really exciting to think about what comes next after spending so much time on S1 and S2 and continuing to focus on its implementation. I do expect that these new research projects, along with other activities in our work plan, are going to keep ourselves at the board and our staff really busy. So given both research projects are large projects, they both require extensive research and analysis. We did decide to exclude some of the proposed projects that were in the request for information, so we could really make more progress on this targeted range of projects that we've talked about. So at our April 2024 meeting, the ISSB decided not to add to specific research projects on the risks and opportunities associated with human rights and the project on integration and reporting. So the rationale for not adding a standalone project on human rights, I guess, encompasses a number of things, but certainly we believe that some aspects of sustainability-related risks and opportunities that are relevant to human rights are likely to be addressed as part of our research project on human capital. Specifically, again, those related risks and opportunities that are part of the entity's own workforce and with workers and the entity's value chain, which you talked about, those could reasonably be expected to affect the entity's prospects and we think could be encompassed. In addition, we observe that many human rights related risks and opportunities associated with affected communities and consumers and end users tend to be industry specific in nature. And therefore, we expect that they might be addressed through our work to enhance the SASB standards.
So on the proposed project on integration and reporting, the feedback from our respondents indicated that although integration and reporting is really important to many stakeholders, relative to the other proposed topics in our consultation, this wasn't identified as a priority for most investors now. So approximately half of the respondents to the request for information, including almost 2/3 of investors, said that a project on integration and reporting should be a lower priority for the next 2 years of our work plan, or made no comment on integration and reporting and asked us to focus on other activities in the next 2 years. But I do think both, I know I do, and I think Michael does want to emphasise that both of these areas are important matters, and our decision not to add these proposed projects to the immediate work plan isn't intended to suggest otherwise. It's just necessary for us to make tough decisions to prioritise activities to facilitate effective and timely delivery of our work. And so we are going to keep monitoring these areas and others and consider whether we should include these projects in our next agenda consultation.
Yes, thanks for adding that, Sue. I think that's a really important note for our listeners to understand. Well, to wrap up our first agenda consultation, we prepared a feedback statement, and that feedback statement summarizes the consultation responses and feedback we received to the request for information, our responses as the ISSB to that feedback, and it sets out our 2024 to 2026 work plan. The feedback statement is available on the IFRS Foundation's website, and we encourage you, our stakeholders, to take a look at that feedback statement for more details on the topics that we've just covered in today's conversation. Sue, I'm now going to hand it over to you for the last agenda item for today, which is an update on the recent developments on some of our key strategic relationships that relate and reinforce our work plan over the next 2 years. These key relationships, as you're going to highlight, reflect our efforts to deliver further harmonization and consolidation of the sustainability reporting landscape in response to the market demand that we certainly have been hearing about since our formation. So over to you, Sue.
Thanks. So it's no secret to anybody listening to this that the sustainability disclosure landscape has for a long time now been a complex picture of various organisations all working hard to help companies disclose sustainability information. And those organisations existed because there was such strong demand in the market for information about sustainability and for disclosure tools and solutions. And what we've been trying to do at the ISSB since we were first established is to provide an anchor for that landscape, building a global baseline and working closely with these other organisations to drive harmonisation and to make it more straightforward for market participants to report efficiently about sustainability and to make that landscape less confusing for investors. And it's worth reminding listeners of what we've already achieved in the first phase of our work at the ISSB. So we consolidated the ISSB standards, the CDSB framework, and the integrated reporting framework into our organisation's toolkit, and we've utilised these materials in our inaugural standards S1 and S2 to streamline reporting. And in addition to that, our standards fully incorporate the TCFD recommendations. And in fact, the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, was officially disbanded because of the publication of S1 and S2. So step one in consolidating the sustainability reporting landscape for capital markets has already been completed as a result of our work. So now we're moving on to the next phase. And so over the next few minutes, we'll talk through how we're working with some key partners and why we think these are important steps to further rationalise the sustainability disclosure landscape. So let's start with the other big global standard setter in this space, the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI. So they've set standards about impacts that help companies that meet the information needs of all stakeholders now for many years. And of course, our partnership with GRI isn't new. We entered into an MOU with them back in March 2022, but of course, we just recently announced an enhancement to that MOU. And what we want to make sure is that for those companies who want to meet the information needs of both investors and a broader range of stakeholders, that that's possible to do in a seamless manner. And that means we're working with GRI to seek to deliver what we call full direct interoperability between our suites of standards. So what does that big string of words mean? What it means in practice is that we're going to work together to jointly identify and seek to align common disclosures that we find that address the information needs under both of our distinct scopes and purposes of our respective standards. So if we can find the same disclosure that's useful for investors and for those reporting on impact to a broad range of stakeholders, we'll try and use the same disclosure in both sets of standards and point to that. And we plan to do that both for our topic or thematic work that you've just been talking about, but also for our sector-based standard setting. And that announcement builds on the work we're already doing with GRI as the convening partner of their Sustainability Innovation Lab in Singapore, and also follows the work we did with the publication of interoperability guidance that we published with GRI about how to disclose GHG emission information in an aligned way using both GRI standards and our climate standard S2. The next strategic relationship I'd like to highlight is with CDP. So companies around the world respond to the CDP questionnaire to provide information to investors. And this year its platform was open to 75,000 organisations around the world. And really importantly, our climate standard S2 is the foundational baseline for CDP's climate disclosure. And the 2024 CDP questionnaire is aligned with IFRS S2. So we've identified CDP as our key global climate disclosure partner, and that's because the CDP questionnaire is a really effective tool to support companies on their path to complying with the ISSB standards. And we're really excited to see companies that use the CDP questionnaire this year. They'll be disclosing IFRS 2 aligned information already. So that's a fabulous way to start on the path to our standards. Moving then on to the GHG Protocol, which is at the core of the GHG emissions measurement. S2 requires GHG emissions to be measured using the 2004 GHG Protocol corporate standard, and also to refer to the GHG requirements around Scope 3 categories, 15 categories of Scope 3. So if you use the ISSB standards for disclosure requirements, you have to use the GHG Protocol for measurement of GHG emissions. So as a result of that, nobody would be surprised to know that we're really keen to make sure that what's in the GHG Protocol works for us to meet the needs of investors in global capital markets. So because of that, the Foundation and the GHG Protocol have signed an agreement to put in place governance arrangements. So the ISSB is actively engaged in any updates and decisions made in relation to the GHG Protocol corporate standard, including having an ISSB representative as an actual observer on the GHG Protocol Independent Standards Board. Moving on next to transition plan disclosures and the transition plan task force. So globally, disclosures about an entity's transition plans are a growing part of corporate climate-related disclosures, and IFRS S2 already requires that information is provided about transition plans when a company has one. So to support the application of these disclosure requirements and to reduce fragmentation in the information that's provided around the world about transition plans, the ISSB has announced that we're going to do more to support transition plan disclosures. And we've decided to do that taking responsibility for the disclosure-specific materials that the Transition Plan Task Force has prepared, starting by housing those on our Sustainability Knowledge Hub. Then in the near term, we're going to take those Transition Plan Task Force materials and turn them into IFRS educational materials. And to do that, we're going to tailor the Transition Plan Task Force materials to ensure they're globally applicable and to make sure they're fully compatible with the IFRS S2. And the objective here is to really make sure that companies have got what they need to provide good disclosure about transition plans to meet investors' information needs. And in the longer term, we're going to consider whether we need to actually go a further step and enhance the application guidance in IFRS S2 about transition plans and whether we should utilise these transition plan task force materials to do that. But don't worry, those people listening, before we do anything like that, it will be subject to full due process, so there'll be an opportunity to comment. And finally, as you discussed earlier, Michael, we're looking at making use of existing relevant initiatives as we do our new research projects to meet the information needs of investors. So as we embark on our research project on nature, we're going to consider specifically how we can build upon the recommendations of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures that were published in September last year. We don't want to start with a clean sheet of paper. We'll look there for inspiration along with some other materials.
Well, thank you, Sue. What a wonderful overview. And I mean, among other things, it just highlights the time, the energy, the focus, and the resources the ISSB are putting into seeking out and managing these key strategic relationships, because we do know that our stakeholders across the market really appreciate this rationalization and harmonization in the disclosure landscape. So thank you for that. I certainly know from my engagements with stakeholders how welcome our work is with these partners and the opportunity it provides to make sure that our landscape, in which we all care so much about, is fit for purpose. So Sue, that brings us to the end of today's webcast. I should mention, for those that are wanting to learn more, I encourage our listeners to read the feedback statement, which is on the IFRS Foundation website. On the website, you'll also find some of the things that Sue highlighted just now, the educational materials that are already available to help companies apply the ISSB standards, and the tools we have for keeping up to date with our progress. And those include links to our monthly podcast and to the ISSB board meeting papers. So again, thank you for your continued interest in our work here at the ISSB. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us today.